I can't help myself from smiling. What the f- And this was the moment where I realized the Studio Ghibli-like comparison earned its moniker. Hi, my name is Exalclaw. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome back. Usually you'd be seeing my face, but my camera decided to be an asshole today, so we're going to be rolling with just audio. Now, Europa is a game I've been looking forward to for more than a few months now, but one with a bit of trepidation. My first instance of hearing this game was through a review code being offered to me months ago by the publisher here at Future Friends Games, but ever since it's been getting closer to release date, I'm seeing it even from sources I usually don't see a lot of hype for a game coming from, at least one of this size. So not only does it already have that additional hype being added to it that I'm always afraid of adding some type of unrealistic expectation in my unconscious mind, but also, when you make a comparison to yourself to a renowned studio like Studio Ghibli, you're kind of asking yourself to follow some big shoes. I feel like you always run the risk of either ballooning your own hype and not meeting expectations, or putting some unrealistic lens on what people could actually expect from your game. But now, after having finished my 3-hour playthrough of Europa, because that's about how long it takes to finish the game if you're not being completionist about it, I can say they nailed it. Europa was developed by Novadesk Entertainment and published by Future Friend Games, and the synopsis is as follows. On the moon Europa, a lush terraformed paradise in Jupiter's shadow, an android named Z sets out in search of answers. Run, glide, and fly across the landscape, solve mysteries in the ruins of a fallen utopia, and discover the story of the last human alive. As you travel, you'll gradually upgrade the capabilities of your Zephyr jetpack, boosting yourself further through the air until you can flow freely into the sky. And just for a little bit of extra background on the studio itself, Novadesk Entertainment, it was actually developed by former Overwatch and Diablo 3 art director Helder Pinto and a small dev team that he assembled. Now let's actually get to talking about the game. Now let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. In terms of visuals, this is where I feel like it became most clear that it had the Studio Ghibli inspiration. Not only does the scenery seem to expand until it disappears into the horizon, but no matter where you look, everything is beautiful. Whether it be the lush green lands with the beautiful architecture around it, whether it be the subterranean caves that somehow feel like they're underwater but they're actually not, or just the snowy mountains that you start traversing towards the end of the game, there is a diverse range of biomes for you to explore that each feel distinct in their own way, including the fact that each of these biomes are actually thriving with wildlife, including the very unique creatures that Europa is home to. This to me is where the biggest similarity to Studio Ghibli films starts to appear, and that the movies are renowned for the way in playing with the relationship between human and nature, and sometimes giving you nature that's familiar but still strange, having its unique twist on it. And Europa, in this case, went with the old technology that is also sentient in their own ways route of differentiating themselves, and I loved it. There's not a ton of different creatures in this game, but each one that you do see stand out. Each one is memorable. And the game has this really unique mechanic with a sketchbook that makes you actually sit with the designs of these creatures and actually taking the time to look at what makes each one of them unique. Not to mention that so many of them are just naturally grazing as you're exploring the game that you start to just kind of pay attention to themselves and watch them in their natural habitat as is. But like I mentioned before, there's also animals that are very familiar on our home planet of Earth, including deer, rabbits, lovely, lovely turtles, and more. All of this on top of the fact that you will be constantly watching a little boy floating and gliding around all these beautiful landscapes as if there's not a care in the world, does an amazing job capturing the whimsical and fantastical nature Studio Ghibli films are renowned for. However, inspiration-wise, thankfully, this game doesn't stop at just looks. It has a lesson for players that should be taken to heart, and that will be familiar to those that have watched the movies, specifically around humans' very strained relationship with nature.
You're going to have everything I couldn't have. Clean water, fresh air, wide open skies. Everything a child deserves. That's what I want for you.
Something that's become especially relevant given the 2 hurricanes that slammed right into Florida recently, and the fact that the West Coast has not stopped being on fire since ever. Something that is kept in mind throughout the entire game and is introduced from minute 1 is that Europa is a terraforming project, and the game is not subtle about the fact that Earth is likely in disarray somewhere else in the universe. Moreover, there's a special attention that should be given to Europa because it is the only successful terraforming project. We've tried this shit a couple of times, and more than a couple of times it's failed. From the get-go, there's a sense of uniqueness and urgency in the history of the story that you're being given here, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the actual gameplay. There's no sense of needing to rush your way way through this game. You're not missing out on anything if you take your time. This is a game that wants you to sit in its environments while also thinking about all the questions and general themes it's raising as you collect these journal pages throughout the game. However, we'll get to the journal pages. First off, I actually want to talk about the mechanics of this game and why I really enjoy the vibe that they create. One of the biggest joys that I got from playing this game is that by design, it fosters a very healthy method of exploration that purposely avoids being exploitative of the environment, or even harming it. To be as straightforward as it can be, there's no attack button, there's no health bar, there's no sense of being in danger, at least in a way that'll harm your character, and I'll explain that in a second. But overall, every button works more in service of your movement and movement only. It wants you to float. I want you to have fun zooming and zipping around the environment. Now, the reason I gave myself that caveat earlier about there being no danger is that there are threats in this game. But I'm being very purposeful about using the word threats. I wouldn't call them enemies. The reason I wouldn't call them enemies is because when they hit you, whether it be the turret that shoots out this purple cannon or these mollusk-like creatures that shoot out their own little cannonballs of purple, none of these actually hurt you. You won't die. And you're not even really knocked out. You have a very funny animation of getting shot out the sky that makes you look crazy for a second, but you're never in actual danger. There's not even a sense of malice. Everything seems more about deterring you or being a deterrent rather than actually trying to cause harm to your character. And what I think that highlights, and what I'm going to explore more in depth later when I get to talking about the narrative part with the journal, is that this world gives you what you give it. If you're kind to it, if you're catering to it, if you're making sure you're not actually going every way to harm it, then it will meet you in kind. It'll treat you kindly, help you along your way. It's still going to have its creatures that are territorial, as all nature does, but nothing here is actually going to go out of its way to hurt you so long as you don't go out of your way to hurt it. And by following this mantra, the game not only just feels peaceful as you're exploring it, it actually turns somewhat intimate. Because there's no rush, because there's nothing to gain from rushing, you just kind of have this sense where you actually can explore the world. This is also helped by the fact that this is a pretty small and very curated experience. You have invisible walls that make sure you're only really working within the bounds of what the game wants to have you working in. So you're not having these endless and what feels like seemingly impossible areas to explore without enough time on your hand. Everything can be explored. It wants you to get to know the environment. It wants you to sit down and look at the creatures. It wants you to just have fun floating around. This is a good point to bring back up the sketchbook feature that I mentioned earlier. Again, I like it not just because it makes you really sit down and pay attention to the design of these creatures. I like what it incentivizes you to do. To actually pause, to stop what you're doing, stop running around and just look, really look at the creatures that you're sharing this land with. Creatures that you'll hopefully come to love. This feature, on top of everything else of just making sure you do things at your own pace, but more than anything, giving you room and space to think, to ponder about what the task at hand is, it really fosters this healthy attitude of love, appreciation, and respect for the nature in front of you. And I love that message for a game that is ultimately about a terraforming project. Considering the fact that this whole game exists because in universe, Earth got fucked up, I think it's a wonderful message to have that from the get-go, you need to have an attitude of, we can't exploit nature, we can't go to war with it, which unfortunately, as you'll soon see, is not something that actually got followed through. You need to learn how to coexist with it. You need to learn how to learn from it. You need to understand that loving nature is not optional, is a necessity if this thing is going to work. It naturally makes you want to just sit there and be like, hey, how do I cohabitate with these guys? How do I learn to work around them? How do I learn to not get shot out of the sky anytime I'm floating around and having a good time? Sure, it might be annoying. No one likes being shot out the sky. But at the end of the day, I'm not being hurt. It's just an annoyance. And meeting an annoyance with violence is just simply not the answer if you intend to be here for decades, for the rest of your species' lifetime. And now, as you'll soon learn, that is unfortunately a message that the people before Z here did not learn. Now, since we're going to be talking about the narrative here, there's going to be some spoilers. Throughout the game, you're going to be picking up these journal pages through each environment, written by the creator of the android Z, his father, Adam. Yes, the metaphor is not lost on me of Adam the creator in this paradise-looking place. Through these journals, you not only learn about Earth's demise and Europa being a terraforming project, but you also learn about all the growing pains that happened. You learn how, despite Adam's best efforts, because he was easily the coolest guy to be on the planet, humanity brought its sickness to Europa. It brought violence, and inevitably started a war. As you continue through the game, You hear through some phenomenal voice acting, may I add, and read about humanity's issues with the planet's creatures and guardians. At first, it starts as small conflicts. Just at first, not really understanding the creatures kind of bugging them where some of the bigger mining construction projects are happening. However, it quickly escalates as you learn about a tunnel incident specifically where the creatures suddenly stampeded and people weren't able to get out of the way fast enough.
A serious one this time down at the mines. A herd of gardeners charged through the valley just as the day's shift was ending, and they collided with the crowd. We did what we could, but some people didn't make it.
And, as are usually followed by casualties, a huge uptick in panic and fear. This is where Adam starts to shine a lot in these journal pages because you can see his patient attitude with it. He's not trying to minimize the tragedy at all, but he is acknowledging the fact that this was not done out of just some random hostility. These animals probably did this for a reason, and it is their job as the newcomers to Europa to figure out why that happened. Unfortunately, not everyone felt the same. From there, you start learning about how more and more people start treating the planet's creatures with outright hostility, despite the fact that at this point, they do know or should know that these creatures really only respond to what's being given to them. The game does a great job of really hammering home the fact that a lot of these creatures are changing and actually outright evolving to combat the firepower being thrown at them. They're changing to meet the hostility that the humans have amped up against them, which then starts to lead into an all-out war between the humans and the creatures of the planet. Again, all of this taking place in the past tense, which I also really like. The fact that this is a story we're learning about as we're going forward, but it's already happened, makes sure that the game still feels peaceful while you're playing it, but also doesn't actually ever lose any emotional weight. What's also especially crazy to me is not only is there a war happening, but because the humans that terraform the planet are starting to get so scared of the creatures, the island that you're spending the entire game running to was actually created by them to be a safe haven. And now, or at least then, anytime that they were mining resources or energy from the planet, all of it was going back to the island. So, in a nutshell, the terraforming project turned into one of just outright good old colonization. And Z and Adam are right smack dab in the middle of it. Not as participants and as gross exploiters, but actually as one of the few people that are spending time with the creatures. Z especially starts to get highlighted through these journals as someone that is starting to make a very deep bond with many of the creatures and guardians on Europa. It's a relationship that reads like mutual respect and love. You know what, before I wasn't going to spoil the major ending, but honestly, if you don't want to hear the major ending, I'll throw up a timestamp here and just skip to that part so you don't hear the major spoiler that I'm going to share now. But in terms of Z and Adam's role here, what gets revealed is tragically, once the conflict actually gets brought to the island, because of course it was going to be brought to the island inevitably, look at some of the creatures that they were fighting, Z gets caught in the crossfire in the horrific battle that's occurring in the island.
It was hell. Armored guardians had arrived. They were locked in battle, weapons flashing. You ran out into the center. You must have thought you could stop them, that they were your friends. You went too fast. I couldn't stop you. I don't even know who it was. Our side or theirs. Something hit you.
It's not clear whose side did it, and I think that's pretty much the point. The fact that this war happened, the fact that humans brought this war to this land, made sure that not only the creatures of the land were suffering, but the people that they brought with them too. Children, in this case. And Adam, unable to deal with the grief of having lost his son, uses the remains of other guardians and creatures of the land to help basically reconstruct his son. So the android Z that we see here and that we're playing for most of the game is his son, just, not fully human anymore. Ultimately turning Z into the perfect metaphor for what Adam and what I believe this game is trying to get across. The need for coexistence. So what does this all mean? Well, what it means is that ultimately Z, and you as a player, are being asked to look at the best of us, like Adam and Z, who love the planet, took the time to learn it, and actually came to love it, versus the worst of us, the exploiters who brought all of our sins from the past planet to another one, who refused to learn. It's a game that, like many of the movies that it's inspired by, asks you a fundamental question. How can we be better? And how does our relationship with nature need to change so that we actually are better? And this game gives a few different answers to that question, and I'm not going to share all of them here because then we'd be here for longer, and I don't want this to be a super long video. So instead, I'll share one of my favorite quotes from the journal to start wrapping this up.
To raise a generation who are not just curiously determined, but determinedly curious. I hope you can grow up that way, my son.
Europa is ultimately a beautiful game that, while not shy at all about its inspiration from Studio Ghibli movies, by the end of its playtime feels like a story of its own. Something that I will not just say is a Studio Ghibli like game, but is a game that should stand on its own 2 feet and should be played on its own merit because of how well curated the experience of learning to love and respect nature is. The fact that it wants you to take the time to explore its environment, to care for it, to choose peace, to be purposeful about how you can be better, and to curate that attitude in such an intentional way deserves its own praises. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment. If you've played the game yourself, I'd love to hear how you liked it yourself. Did you get the same takeaways that I did? Did you get something different out of it? What's your favorite Studio Ghibli movie? Hell, why not? Talk about that for a while if you want to. I'll give anyone any excuse to gush about their favorite movies. Take care of yourself. Take care of your loved ones. Ciao.
The greatest pleasure in my life is watching you watch the world. There's so much I want to tell you, so much to teach.
They just wanted me to shut up for 5 seconds, and they just sort of throw me into a hyperspace continuum. I mean, I get it, but like, Jesus.